So the project that Michelangelo is asked to do, instead of continuing to the facade of San Lorenzo, is to create a new chapel, a burial chapel for this new generation of Medici family members. Plus, the Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano de' Medici had actually never received a proper burial, and so their bodies needed to be given burial in this same chapel. What you're seeing here is a floor plan of part of the Church of San Lorenzo. It's the area around the altar. Here's the space of the high altar. And then on one end of the transept arm, you have the old sacristy, which you see here, which was completed by Brunelleschi in the 15th century and decorated by Donatello, and we'll look at it in just a moment. And what Michelangelo is asked to do is to create a symmetrical addition to the church. So the form of the space is the same as the old sacristy, and it is called the new sacristy. And this was to be filled with some sort of monument to these Medici men. What's a little confusing here is that there are two Giulianos and two Lorenzos that are buried in the chapel in the new sacristy. So you have Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano. Then you have Lorenzo's son, whose name was Giuliano, and Giuliano's son, whose name was, of course, Lorenzo. So it's a little confusing. One way that we help distinguish who they are is that Giuliano, the son of Lorenzo, had the title Duke of Nemours, and Lorenzo, the son of Giuliano, had the title of Duke of Urbino. After, and this is he becomes the Duke of Urbino in the short period of time when the usual Duke of Urbino from the Della Rovere family would have been in charge in any case. So anyway, there's this burial site that Michelangelo is asked to do. And this will be a project that occupies him for a significant amount of time. This is the nave of the Church of San Lorenzo. Actually, what you're seeing here is if you were standing pretty close to the high altar and looking towards the door, but this is what the space looks like. And it's using this gray stone and white areas, which was the kind of aesthetic of Brunelleschi. And that really becomes part of the aesthetic of Florence. And I don't know how well you can actually make this out, but on the ceiling there are the coat of arms of the Medici family repeated all the way down the space in the nave, because as you'll remember, only they could have their coats of arms there. So they're really making claim to the whole church. Even though in reality, in these side chapels here, these were actually owned by other families, but those families couldn't even put their coat of arms inside of those chapel spaces. Quite an amazing arrangement. This is what the old sacristy looks like. It was finished around 1420 or so, and though it looks very distorted here and very rectangular, it's a cube-shaped space, and it too has that combination of gray decoration with blank white walls. And you can see that there's this, these big arches that kind of go along with this idea of the triumphal arch, and in that way is a resurrection of an ancient Roman type. The triumphal arches were used by the Roman emperors to process through. They were coming back to the city from various triumphs. And in the Christian context within the church, and especially in the context of a funerary chapel, the triumphal arch is often used as a symbol of Christ's resurrection, his triumph over death, and obviously the hoped for triumph over death of the people that are buried here at the moment of Christ's second coming. So this is the space that Michelangelo creates. He too uses this gray and white patterning, and clearly it's meant to help the design of the whole structure of San Lorenzo be cohesive. But Michelangelo also does some pretty bizarre and innovative things here. There are very shallow niches here that couldn't actually have held much of anything. There are fake windows in some sections, fake doors even. And the sculptures, as we'll see, seem really squeezed and uncomfortable within this space. The other places where you get the sense of squeezing or compression is in the corners, where pilasters are just sort of squeezed in to the corner. You have overlapping and very strangely shaped pediments over these niches, and those pediments overlap with the pilasters as well. These, having things overlap would never have happened in the pure early Renaissance and high Renaissance ideals for architecture, where everything had to be separated and show off its function and be really clear and straightforward. So Michelangelo is conscientiously breaking those rules here. He's trying to create a new style. He is trying to create meaning through the refusal to follow the rules of Renaissance architecture. And he uses decoration, the architectural decoration, to really create meaning in this space in important ways. For example, you'll see that you have much, greater quantity of decoration. There's really no empty wall space at all on the ground floor. And then that lightens up considerably in this level, this sort of intermediary level. And then you have completely open spaces in the vaults above. And so you really get this sense of ascent. This is something that Michelangelo would have learned probably from looking at the inside of the Pantheon, that great high Roman imperial building, and would have been influenced by it. It has exactly the same kind of format for the decoration and has the same kind of meaning of the ascent of the soul to the heavens. Just the difference here being that that ascent is meant in the Christian context, the ascent to heaven. So as we look on the ground level, what we see is a bunch of sculptures that are compressed within these wall tombs. You have two sets on each side with a seated figure and two reclining figures. And then you have on one end of the altar space an altar with three sculptures, or rather two single sculptures, and then a group sculpture of the Virgin and Child. Just to show you some views, this is standing behind the actual altar of the chapel and looking towards you can see that the altar makes the priest look out and see the Virgin and Child flanked by the Medici saints Cosmas and Damian over here. And then you have these groups on each side, as I showed you previously. And you can see that the two figures that are squeezed in these niches are also not looking towards the altar as we would expect, but looking towards where the Virgin is. And we're supposed to understand this as them looking to the Virgin as an intercessor. And they're also looking at the Medici name saints, who were supposed to be the protectors of the Medici family. So on this side, we have Giuliano de' Medici, and he is dressed as a soldier. He was in the papal forces, and so it makes sense that he could be shown in this way, though his armor is certainly Roman in origins. It's not contemporary Renaissance armor. So there's that idea of revival of antiquity in that sense. And then you have these two rather strange looking reclining figures. You have Night over here, this female who is the personification of night. And then you have Day reclining on this side, this bulky male nude figure. Night is the figure that is most complete. And we'll see that Michelangelo, in fact, did not finish this project, and I'll talk about why that is, but we can see that Night is the most complete of the figures. Not only is the body of this figure in good completed state, but also we have some symbols that help to identify who she is. There's an owl, there's a crescent moon on her tiara, there are poppies that you can see in the sort of garlands that go around here, and you can see them here as well. And those are all symbols of night. There's also a mask here, which is also a sort of poetic reference to night, and quite an interesting mask here because it's actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo. It has his signature mashed up nose from his earlier encounter with Pietro Torrigiani that we've already talked about. The figure of Day, as I said, this large male figure, looks, to be in this rather uncomfortable position, as is Night, these really twisting forms. This twisted torso is certainly referencing ancient sculpture that Michelangelo was influenced by, especially Laocoon in the Torso Belvedere. And putting them in these uncomfortable positions really emphasizes that muscular strain that position causes. And Michelangelo is certainly exploring how to really push to the limits this idea of torsion and muscle strain. And these uncomfortable positions of the figures are kind of more interesting and more dynamic to look at than clearly he's trying to get away from those pyramidal super stable figures in contrapposto of the earlier Renaissance, and is forging a new type of style here. The way the figures look right now, they look like they're getting ready to just slide off the top of these tombs here, these sarcophagi on each side. And in part, that sense of them sliding off is due to the fact that these were not completed. And in fact, you can still see, especially in the figure of Day, that there's still quite a bit of the initial block of stone here that needed to be carved away and just never was. Plus, there was the plan to have two figures, one on each side, of river gods that would sustain these figures above, and they would not have appeared to be sliding off as they now do, and those river gods were never completed either. Here's a detail to show you the beautiful form of Night, and you can see that he finished it to such an extent that you have the patina, the sheen of the marble that the artist would do after all of the carving, that he would then begin the polishing and working on getting the surface of the marble up to the sheen that he wanted it to be. So really quite complete in some areas, but certainly not in others. The figure of Night is meant to express the aging woman, and in fact, this whole cycle of these allegorical figures in the chapel that represent different times of the day is meant to represent on a much broader scale the passage of time in human life and the different moments of human existence. And so she is meant to show a woman that has already had her children, and is a matron. She's in, probably meant to be understood as in her, I don't know, 40s or 50s. And you can see the flabbiness of the skin here really is meant to show that she has given birth. She has certainly very oddly shaped breast. And as you read about in the Sistine Chapel discussion readings, some art historians have interpreted Michelangelo's treatment of the female form as a way that he's either grappling with his own sexual desire, or that he is trying to express the virtues of the particular women he's showing, the virtues being um, expressed by him as being male attributes and thus masculinizing the figure. And truly in this figure, it looks like she has just, that basically it's a male figure that has had breast attached to it and the skin made a little floppier here in the center. Some have suggested that, well, one article in particular suggested that perhaps Michelangelo in his dissections of bodies had seen a cancerous breast, and that is what he is representing here. It was an oncologist that wrote this article and looked at the form of the breast, and evidently the dimpling and even the lumpiness of the breast here indicates that perhaps this was a study after of a body of a woman that had had breast cancer, but that's entirely speculative in my opinion. Here's that mask. You could see Michelangelo's inclusion of his mashed up nose. And here's the figure of Giuliano. And you can see Giuliano really looks like he's just completely squeezed into this niche. He can't stand up. There's no space for that. He too is just kind of, seated uncomfortably, just right on the edge of his seat, so that he can look out and look beyond and see the sculptures of the Virgin and Child. But an uncomfortable sort of looking figure. A famous story about this figure is that one of Michelangelo's contemporaries said, "This doesn't look anything like Giuliano." And Michelangelo wasn't trying to express the actual likeness of this figure. And what he says is that, in 1500 years, who's going to know the difference? And of course, that's quite true. And it shows Michelangelo knew we'd be talking about him even hundreds of years later. But what is important about this is that it shows that Michelangelo is thinking about these figures more as representatives of ideals of some sort, not as being portraits of the men that the tomb group was dedicated to. Looking on the other side of the chapel, we have the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici, and he is shown with these two reclining figures of dusk and dawn. And we'll look at those figures in greater detail. We have, the figure of dusk, which is pretty far along in the sculpting process. And it's a fairly youthful male, perhaps older though than the figure of night. I'm sorry, not of night, but of day that we saw earlier on the other side of the chapel. We can look at them and see what you think, but I think this guy is probably, had he been completed, would have looked more youthful. He certainly has a much bulkier sort of figure musculature than we have in the figure of dusk over here. This guy's pretty bulky too. But the face would suggest that he is meant to show age. And again, if this is a cycle of the times of day, and we have dusk, which would be the end of the afternoon going into night, it would make sense that he would be shown as being older than the representation of day. On the other side of him is Dawn, and so she's the one that really starts the cycle. And in fact, she certainly is the one that looks the youngest of all of these figures. We see she has a taut stomach, unlike her female counterpart on the other side. And really, Michelangelo has given us a beautiful female form here, softly modeled, not his usual masculinized females. Um, and she really is quite a lovely figure here. On the other side, at the end of the chapel, is the space where we have the bodies of Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, the magnificent ones, the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano killed in the Pazzi conspiracy. And what we see here is a group with the Virgin and Child, flanked by Cosmos and Damien, the Medici patron saints. As I said, they're named saints. They were medical doctors that had been persecuted by one of the Roman emperors because of their faith in Christianity. In this central group, again, we can see these figures were not completed, but what we see is a really bulky Christ child for sure, and he's twisted completely around so that he can nurse from his mother's breast. This figure is, he's just so twisted around. It really, again, shows us an example of that new aesthetic that Michelangelo is introducing here. The figure is twisted as the allegorical figures on the tombs were. Showing the Christ child nursing is not a new subject for Michelangelo. We saw it in the Madonna of the Stairs as well. And again, it shows the nurturing nature of the church, which Mary represents. And just a full view of the chapel to end with here. What we see in this chapel that's so important is this new treatment of the figure, this conscientious breaking of the rules of architecture, and these are stylistic aspects that have an enormous influence on the artist working in Florence as Michelangelo is working on this group, and then even after he is no longer in Florence and this project remains incomplete. What happens that causes Michelangelo to stop working on this project is that there's another shift in power, which I'll be talking about in greater depth. But the Medici kind of fall out of power again. The Republic returns briefly. Michelangelo works for the Republic. And when the Medici return and attain absolute power in Florence, Michelangelo fears for his life, and for good reason, because the new Duke of Florence has sent a hitman after Michelangelo. And what has been discovered very recently is that Michelangelo hid away the whole time. We knew he was in hiding, and there had been stories that Michelangelo was hiding somewhere in the chapel or somewhere in San Lorenzo, but nobody really knew for sure. But recently, they found I'm going to jump ahead, forgive me. They found a new space in it's sort of a space that's adjacent to the chapel. It was just had been sealed off and just didn't know it was actually in there. But what they found was this kind of hallway space, completely enclosed, and on the walls they found these gorgeous drawings, all by Michelangelo. And you can get a sense of this guy being shut off in this space, bored to death. Someone clearly is bringing him food and drink and other necessities, but he's just hiding away in this space and just drawing and passing the time, thinking about new projects. And they really are quite beautiful, these drawings on the wall. Quite an amazing find. I skipped by this very quickly just now, but to backtrack, I do want to tell you about this one last project of Michelangelo's in the space of San Lorenzo. So even as he's working on the Medici Chapel, the new sacristy, he's also working on this project. He was just a super crazy busy guy. But the project here was for an entranceway for the Laurentian Library, a library that Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, had initially created. And Michelangelo actually does the design for the library and for this vestibule area, this entrance hall that leads you into the space of the library. And it's a beautiful space and a real gem of this new kind of style that Michelangelo is employing, as we saw in the new sacristy. You've got these strange waterfall-like stairs that really curve out, and they're very shallow stairs. They're very strange little stairs. Then on the side you have more regular, sort of rectangular stairs. In other areas, though, you can see some of those same, sorry, as I was saying, sorry about that. You can see some of the other stylistic characteristics similar to what we saw in the new sacristy, such as the columns here that are embedded in the wall, thus serving absolutely no function whatsoever. That was just anathema to high Renaissance architecture, where columns would be freestanding and would serve a supportive function, and you would see that function clearly in the way that the architecture was organized. Instead, here, they're there purely as decoration. They serve no purpose whatsoever beyond that. You have these same shallow niches and other spaces that serve absolutely no rhyme or reason. There's no function to them whatsoever. This is a side view of the stairs, so you get a better sense of what they're like. You also see he has these huge brackets underneath the layer here, which is below the embedded columns. Again, these brackets serve absolutely no function whatsoever. Those two should have been a sort of supportive structural element in high Renaissance architecture, but here we're starting to see something new happen. And this is another view of the whole space. It too has that real sense of everything being super compressed, especially on the ground floor, kind of overwhelmed by these incredibly large elements of architecture in what is truly a very small space. You can see that overlapping, just as was the case in the new sacristy, the pediments that go over where the columns are. That stuff never happened in those high Renaissance architects that really followed the rules. And this is just a peek inside of the library, which he also designed, but I won't have time to go into here. All right, that's enough for this lecture. See you next time.